In October of 2017, 28-year-old archaeology graduate student Elijah Dean set out on a lonely hike in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona. He planned to explore ancient Apache petroglyphs and return the next day. 2 years passed, and when experienced guide Lou Garcia stumbled upon a rusty barrel wedged between rock fragments in an abandoned mountain tunnel, he had no idea he was about to uncover one of Arizona's most chilling secrets. The morning of October 23, 2017, was calm and windless. A gray haze of dust stood over the Superstition Mountains, where stone spires rise from a sandy plateau. A gray sedan was parked in the parking lot near the Pearl Trail. Behind the wheel was a young archaeologist named Elijah Dean, a graduate student at the University of Arizona who had come here not for adventure, but for evidence. He was not interested in the legend of the gold of the vanishing Dutchman that has attracted treasure hunters for centuries, but in another, much older story. Dean believed that the Apaches had left a map in these mountains, not for treasure, but for sacred places underground, where rituals could once have been performed. He deciphered the ancient petroglyphs that cover the cliffs of Superstition as navigational markers to a network of underground tunnels. His colleagues were cautiously skeptical of this hypothesis. But for Elijah, it was a matter of faith, scientific, calm, stubborn faith. In his office at the university, he still had a map from the 19th century archives on which he had penciled in coincidences between old mine shafts and the location of petroglyphs. It was these coincidences that brought him here to the mountains, where, according to the locals, the earth itself hides secrets. Around 8 in the morning, Elijah was seen by a volunteer from the information center, Mrs. Collins. She was cleaning the parking lot when he stopped by to check the map. A brief description would later appear in her report. He was reserved, polite, talking about some branches on the north slope. Seemed focused. A few minutes later, he disappeared among the rocks and cacti, heading in the direction of old mountain trails that were hardly used anymore. Around noon, Professor Vanessa Reynolds received an email from him, sent via satellite messenger. "Professor, I'm at the site. The petroglyphs match the map from the archive. The climb is difficult, but I'm almost at the entrance. If there is no connection, don't worry, it's the mountains. I'll be back tomorrow night. ED." That was the last communication. When he didn't respond to messages or calls 2 days later, the professor contacted the Pinal County Ranger Service. She knew his personality, meticulous, attentive, and far from adventurous. If he didn't get in touch, something serious had happened. The search began the next morning. A group of rangers went to the Pearl Trail, accompanied by dogs and volunteers. A helicopter flew over the mountains, but thick fog and rocky drops hindered the reconnaissance. The only trace found was a backpack strap stuck on a prickly pear thorn a mile off the main trail. The trail disappeared as suddenly as the hiker himself. After 3 days of fruitless searching, 2 more units from Tucson joined the operation. They combed the canyons where temperatures rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. At night, when the heat subsided, the wind could be heard in the rocks, sounding like human voices. Some of the volunteers later admitted that on those nights they could not shake the feeling that someone was watching them from above. On the 7th day, the search was stopped. There was no body, no belongings, no signs of a struggle. The police drew up a standard report: a possible fall into a gorge, heat stroke, or an attack by a wild animal. The university sent an official request to the Forest Service, and Professor Reynolds continued to search for several weeks at her own expense. But the mountains were silent. In early December, the case was formulated: disappeared under unclear conditions. In his memory, a small stone sign with a plaque was installed at the entrance to the trail. It still stands there, between the cacti and red boulders, reminding us that even in our time, a scientist can disappear as easily as gold from legends. Thus began a story that would later be called one of the most mysterious in the Superstition Mountains. And although the search stopped, the mountains themselves seem to be waiting to remind us of themselves again. 2 years have passed. The Superstition Mountains stood quiet and indifferent again, as if they had never known Elisha Dean's name. The sun scorched the slopes just as mercilessly, and the desert wind blew dust over the dried riverbeds, sweeping away even memories. In November of 2019, the Pinal County Court officially declared Elisha dead. The case of his disappearance was sent to the archives under the standard code, closed for lack of new evidence. For his parents, this decision was painful but inevitable. They traveled from Tucson to the mountains to install a small memorial sign, a stone with a brass plate engraved with the words, "Elisha Dean, archaeologist, disappeared in these mountains in search of the truth." The sign stood by the side of the Peril Trail where he had gone on his last hike. Hikers sometimes left stones or dried flowers near it, although most did not even know who he was. For Professor Vanessa Reynolds, the stone meant nothing. In her 60s, she had seen many missing archaeologists and ruined expeditions, but Elijah's death did not fit into any of her scientific experiences. She did not believe that he had simply gotten lost or fallen into a gorge. His last letter, preserved in a printout, lay on the table under glass, next to a map with red marker dots with petroglyphs. Reynolds returned to these materials every week, rereading his notes as if trying to feel the logic of his thinking that could have led to a fatal mistake. She spoke to her students about him in the past tense, but there was never any final acceptance in her voice. In the corridor of the department hung his photo, a smiling young man with a short beard holding a piece of pottery. The caption under the photo read, "Elijah Dean, Field Studies, Arizona, 2016. None of the new students knew that this photo was taken a year before he disappeared forever. Life went back to normal. Newspapers had long since stopped mentioning his name. The local police were busy with new cases, and isolated hikers continued to get lost in the mountains. But Professor Reynolds did not give up. She would sometimes call the rangers, asking about things she had found, old mines, forgotten trails. Her colleagues thought this was a manifestation of obsessive guilt, which is often the case when you lose a student whom you considered almost a son. But Reynolds believed there was more to the disappearance than an accident. As the university faded into the evening light, hundreds of miles away in Tucson, another man was heading for the mountains. Luis Garcia, whom his friends called simply Lou, was preparing a new hiking route. He was 45 and had spent most of his life in these parts. A former miner and now a guide for thrill seekers, he knew the Superstition Mountains like the back of his hand. His past was written in the scars on his arms and tired eyes, decades underground, hundreds of miles in the dark, the smell of rock, dust, and grease that wouldn't wash away even after his career. After the mines closed, Lou converted an old pickup truck into a mobile camp and started taking extreme tourists to hard-to-reach places. His routes were not sold by official agencies. Only those who knew about him by word of mouth went there. This time, he planned to develop a new tour that would go through a system of abandoned tunnels on the northern slope of the mountains. A place where no tourist had ever set foot and where even rangers did not risk working without special equipment. In the morning, Lou left his Jeep on an abandoned forest road and took a flashlight, rope, and camera. The air in the mountains was dry, and dust hung in every ray of light. The old tunnel he was going down began in a crack between two boulders. Inside, it smelled of rust, wet stones, and time. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and dust fell from the ceilings as if to warn him not to go any further. About 100 feet from the entrance, he saw something that did not belong there. Among the rubble, he could see a rusty surface, round and metallic. Lou bent down and shone his flashlight. There was an old barrel in front of him. It was deformed, squeezed into a niche, as if it had been pushed in. The metal was blackened, with welding marks on it. It couldn't have been a natural formation. Someone had deliberately hidden it deep underground. He touched the walls, cold, rough. He tried to roll the stones away, but the layer of dust and debris made it almost impossible. A thought flashed through his mind. Leave it as it was. However, professional curiosity won out. Lou took out his phone, took several photos from different angles, and shot a short video. Then he looked around the darkness again. There was something unbearably tense in the silence of the tunnel, as if the air itself was listening to his breath. When he came out, the sun was already setting. The air was heavy with dust, and the sky was red like rust on metal. On the way home, Lou couldn't shake the strange feeling. In the rearview mirror, it seemed to him that the same dust he had picked up in the mine was trailing behind the car. Late at night, sitting on the porch of his house on the outskirts of Apache Junction, he opened the photos on his phone. In one of them, the flashlight reflected off something at the base of a barrel. Lou zoomed in on the image. Amidst the shadows and rust, he could see a small plastic rectangle, an ID or card. It bore the logo he had known since childhood, a stylized letter A with the inscription University of Arizona. Lou froze. He felt cold, even though the night was warm. He opened his laptop and typed in a search engine. Missing archaeologist, Superstition Mountains, Arizona. The first result was a photo of a smiling young man wearing a hat with the headline, Elijah Dean, graduate researcher, missing since October 2017. Lou stared at the screen for a long time. The dust hanging in the darkness of the tunnel came back to his eyes. And for the first time in his years of work in the mountains, he felt that he had found not a root, but a grave. The news of the discovery on the northern slope of Superstition spread among the locals faster than dust in the canyons. The next morning, after Lou Garcia's call, a special team arrived at the site. The team included detectives from Pinal County, forensic scientists, medical examiners, and a team of rescue workers trained to work underground. They arrived before sunrise when the mountain air was still cool and clean, but the smell of rust, moisture, and old rock was already underfoot. The tunnel where Lou came across the barrel was in an abandoned mine system known only from old 19th century maps. It was accessed only by winding serpentines that had long since been overgrown. The group descended with caution. The stones crumbled underfoot, and the old beams that once supported the ceiling crunched with every movement. The echoes of lanterns flickered on the walls, as if someone was still breathing in the darkness. The coordinates provided by Lou Garcia were accurate. A few dozen feet from the entrance, in a depression between two boulders, a piece of metal was indeed visible. Rust had eaten the barrel up to halfway through. It had lost its shape, its edges were embedded in the rock, and the surface was covered with a layer of red dust that looked like dried blood. The rescuers cleared the passage slowly, working with crowbars and brushes. The slightest careless movement could have caused a collapse. The operation lasted several hours. The narrow space made it difficult to work, and each breath of air seemed harder than the last. When the barrel was finally removed from the cliff, it was placed on a plastic sheeting, and documentation began. Detective Mark Williams, who led the investigation, stood nearby, watching every move the experts made. He was in his 60s and had been through enough cases to keep his cool, but this time there was something in the air that caused a quiet, animalistic dread. When the lid was cut open, the smell of old iron mingled with something else, pungent and sweet, like burnt organic matter. There was a body inside, a skeleton in a half-bent position, crammed into a narrow space, as if the person was trying to protect themselves from shock or cold. The clothes were partially preserved, a shirt whose fabric had become like parchment, a belt, and shoes that crumbled when touched. The skull had a flat hole in the back of the head. One precise shot. Experts determined that the death was caused by a gunshot wound, not dehydration or a fall. Things were found near the remains. At the bottom of the barrel was a backpack, stuck together by moisture, but intact. Inside were a notebook, a power bank, a flashlight, a compass, a folding knife, and several stone samples in paper bags. Everything looked as if the man was going to continue his research. The only thing missing was a camera, a phone, and a GPS navigator. Things that could have contained data. Criminalist Janice Martin, leaning over her notebook, turned the pages carefully so as not to damage the wet paper. As the sun began to hide behind the ridge, she was able to read one pencil entry on the last page. The letters were squeezed in, as if written in a hurry, but legible. "They are lying. This is not gold. It's something else, and they know I know. I have to go more carefully. I'll meet DS at the trailhead at 15. The initials DS were the first mystery. Who was he? A partner, an informant, an enemy? Williams reread the text carefully, stopping at the words, "They lie." His intuition, honed over years of work, told him that this recording was made not for anyone, but for himself, as a warning left in case something happened to him. After the body was recovered, experts confirmed the identity of the deceased by dental records. It was Elijah Dean, a graduate student who disappeared 2 years ago. His family was notified the same evening. Professor Reynolds, having learned about the discovery, arrived at the site, but was not allowed to enter the mine. She stood near the border, clutching a copy of the same letter she had received on the day he disappeared. The official investigation began the next morning. The case was reclassified from disappearance to murder. All the evidence indicated that the death was caused by a deliberate shot to the back of the head at close range. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of ligatures, meaning that the victim either trusted the killer or did not have time to realize what was happening. Detective Williams sat in his mobile headquarters studying the forensic report. In his opinion, this story had nothing to do with a robbery. No logic could explain why the criminal had left the valuables behind but taken the electronics. It was a deliberate elimination of a witness, a person who knew something he should not have known. At the meeting to discuss further actions, Williams summarized briefly. "This is not a coincidence or a legend. He was not searched for 2 years because someone made sure no one found him." He spoke in a steady voice, but his eyes burned with the same flame that his colleagues saw only in cases where the truth was deeper than a simple crime. As darkness descended on the mountains, the police were already removing the sealed barrel, wrapped in thick black plastic, and loading it into a van and driving it to the forensic center in Florence. The headlights glided across the stone slopes, and for a moment it seemed as if the mountains themselves were watching the convoy of vehicles. An investigation awaited that would reveal more than just the fact of the murder. In Elijah's old notes, among the half-erased words and strange coordinates, there was a thread that could lead to those who did not want anyone to know what he had discovered. And it all started with a short, barely pressed line. "I'll meet DS." The rain, which had started at dawn, was not going to stop. The Superstition Mountains were shrouded in a fog that looked like smoke. Detective Mark Williams was sitting in his car outside the Apache Junction police station, flipping through an old notebook and reading over the note he had found in the barrel. "Meet DS at the trailhead at 15. Several weeks had passed since Elijah Dean's body had been pulled from the mine, but the case was not moving forward. All the evidence they found boiled down to a few unknown initials. Still, Williams's intuition told him that DS was no coincidence. He had seen hundreds of such short entries in the diaries of dead and missing people. Usually, the name of someone who knew more than others was hidden there. Williams and his partner, Sergeant Kenneth Boyd, started with the obvious. They looked at all the names in the reports for the day Elijah had last been in contact. The list included rangers, local guides, tourist shop owners, even a few amateur historians. Among them was the name of David Stone, a 65-year-old historian, author of several books on superstition legends, and head of the local historical society. His initials matched the notebook entry perfectly. Stone lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, among collections of old maps and yellowed newspaper clippings. When the detectives knocked on the door, he opened it immediately, without hesitation, as if he had been expecting them. Tall, thin, with a graying beard and calm movements, he looked more like a university professor than an ordinary Arizona resident. "Yes, I knew Elijah," he said, inviting them into his office. "We had been corresponding for about a month. He asked me questions about Apache legends and old maps." A very enthusiastic young man. On the table in front of Stone was an open book, his own work about the disappearing Dutchman. He spoke calmly, choosing his words carefully. He told me that Elijah was supposed to come to see him to discuss the petroglyphs, which, according to the young man, pointed to certain underground passages. "I waited for him on the trail near the old bridge," Stone said. "But he never showed up. Then I heard he was reported missing. I thought maybe he changed his mind or got lost." Williams watched his every move. Stone spoke confidently, even with a hint of regret. His voice did not tremble, and his hands did not betray his excitement. At first glance, he looked like a typical figure of an old intellectual living in the past. But Williams had the feeling that the man was too well prepared for the conversation. When it came to the day of Elisha's disappearance, Stone provided an alibi. He was giving a lecture at the Florence Museum. The organizers confirmed his presence, and camera footage showed him entering the hall. Dozens of attendees could testify that he was there at the exact time Elijah was supposed to arrive for the meeting. Stone looked Williams straight in the eye as he said goodbye. "Detective, I'm sorry about this guy, but sometimes people who search too deeply find things that are better left alone." His words sounded like philosophy, but there was a hint in his voice, a subtle, almost elusive one. When the door closed, Williams told his partner, "He's not lying, but he's not telling the truth either." The detective spent the next few days in his office among reports, books, and copies of archival documents. He reread Stone's works, looking for references to mines, caves, or unknown dungeons. His book, published in the mid-90s, did contain a chapter on strange finds fragments of pottery, shards, and mineral samples that allegedly belonged to an unknown culture. But in all subsequent editions, this section disappeared. Meanwhile, Professor Vanessa Reynolds continued her own investigation. She received permission from the police to view Elisha's belongings found in the barrel. Among them was a small leather-bound notebook, not the one that became evidence, but another, personal one. It was not part of the official materials of the expedition and was probably kept in his apartment. The professor opened it on the last pages. There, in small handwriting, were entries with dates a few days before the disappearance. "Stone is lying. He knows more than he's saying. My map matches perfectly with the old reports of strange findings in the mines that he himself described in a book in '95. Why did he remove them later? What did they find there?" Reynolds read these lines over and over again. Her hand involuntarily clenched the edge of the table. It was as if Stone had not only withheld details, but had deliberately directed Elijah to a certain place, knowing that he was in danger. Williams received a copy of the notes from the professor the next day. When he read the last page, his suspicion turned to certainty. Stone might not have pulled the trigger, but he was the one who knew where Elisha would go and what he was looking for. If there was an ambush in the mountains, someone had to have prepared it. The detective applied to the court for a search warrant. His arguments were simple. The last person to have contact with the victim had a motive to keep silent. Stone had knowledge that could be dangerous for those who wanted to keep the legends under control. In the afternoon, the warrant was signed. Williams went to the historian's house. A thunderstorm was already gathering on the horizon, and the wind was swaying the dry cacti by the roadside. In the car's office, the detective repeated quietly to himself, "If he really knows something, this story is older than all our archives." A night of searching lay ahead, and for the first time in his many years on the force, Williams felt he was touching something beyond the realm of ordinary crime. In the mountains of Superstition, a shadow with initials began to come to life, and its every step left behind not just dust, but traces of someone else's truth. The search of David Stone's house began at dawn. Superstitions still stood in the fog like sleeping giants, and the desert wind carried the smell of rain and dust. Detective Mark Williams watched as his team set up the floodlights and installed the generator. Stone sat on the porch with his hands behind his back. He looked calm, almost indifferent. He answered questions briefly, as if it were all just a formality that was about to end. The house was tidy and strangely sterile, like an exhibition space, not the home of a man who had lived here for decades. In the study, there are shelves of books about the history of Arizona, several old geological maps, and neatly folded documents on the table. The computer is clean, with no hidden files or deleted correspondence. Even the recycle bin is empty, too spotless for a man suspected of involvement in a murder. Williams went through the house twice, but the real breakthrough came when the CSI, a young agent from Phoenix, turned his attention to the garage. In the far corner was an old metal tool shelf. It looked tightly embedded in the wall, but underneath it was a barely visible lock. When the shelf was pushed aside, a small safe was revealed. Its lock was old, but Williams picked the code almost intuitively. Stone used the date of birth of his favorite historian. Inside were papers packed in a transparent bag. Not money, not weapons, but documents. A preliminary contract for the purchase of a large plot of land in the Superstition Mountains. The buyer was a company called Vista Development. Williams immediately realized that he had seen this name before. In local files, it was listed as a contractor for several development projects that had suddenly come to a halt due to permitting issues. The detective looked through the documents carefully. The plans showed a territory of more than 3,000 acres, seemingly a priceless wasteland unsuitable for construction. The land had the status of a dry zone, devoid of natural resources. Its cadastral value was minimal. But among the papers, Williams found another folder, a geological report. It contained maps of underground flows, drilling results, and humidity readings. And most importantly, it contained a graph of the aquifer that ran under the site. It turns out that Stone knew about an underground source hidden under the rocks. If the information had become public, the land would immediately have been placed under state protection as a natural resource, and any development plans would have lost their meaning. But if kept secret, the land could be bought for a song and sold to developers for 10 times the price. When Williams questioned Stone, he did not deny the papers he had found, but tried to give them an innocent interpretation. "It's just investment research," he said in a steady voice. "I was hired as a consultant. I was just collecting historical data on land ownership." But a shadow appeared in his eyes, as short as a breath. Williams knew he had seen this reaction before. A person who is caught in a lie always gives away a little something, like a pause between words or a sideways glance. The detective checked the information about the Vista Development Company. It turned out to be fictitious. The legal address was an old office without a sign, and the only signatory on the documents was Stone himself. But among the letters found in the safe was the name of another man, Jacob Ryder. In several reports, he appeared as a field coordinator, someone who provides logistics, security, and communications during geological surveys. Williams immediately noticed a note. "Military experience, knows the area well." Ryder was a former soldier who had been discharged from the service for misconduct. According to unofficial sources, after the Army, he was engaged in the protection of private facilities and carried out delicate errands for businessmen who did not want to involve the police. Everything began to fall into a clear pattern. Stone was not just a historian who was fond of legends. He was at the head of a land scam disguised as a scientific project. Ryder was his field enforcer, a man who knew how to keep others silent. Elisha Dean, with his research on underground systems and petroglyphs, could have been a deadly witness. Williams sat in Stone's office looking at maps and drawings. His fingers touched a line that marked a mountain range. Two lines intersected exactly where the archaeologist had disappeared, an old mine and an underground spring. All the lines converged to one point. When Stone was being taken out of the house, he suddenly said, looking directly into the detective's eyes, "You don't understand, Mark. It's just the ground. Blood has been shed over it because people have always wanted to own what is under their feet." Williams did not answer. His thoughts were further away, in the mountains where it all began. If Ryder really had something to do with the disappearance, then he could have pulled the trigger. But the main question remained: who else knew about this underworld and why they were trying so desperately to hide it? As the team collected the seized materials, Williams looked at the dark ground beneath his feet. The dust that had collected on his boots seemed thicker than usual, almost red, like rust or old blood. He thought that maybe Stone was right. The ground really does hold everything, both the water and the sins of those who stand on it. Now there were two names in the file. One belonged to the man who thought about profits, and the other to the man who acted with his hands. And although officially it was still a story about a missing archaeologist, the detective already knew that he was on the verge of a legend and a crime. And every step further led deeper into the ground, which smelled not of dust, but of blood. When the warrant for Jacob Ryder's arrest was signed, Detective Mark Williams had not slept for several nights. The man's name had first appeared in Stone's seized documents, but now it was in all police reports. Ryder was a former military man, a survivalist who had served in hotspots, and after his discharge, he worked as a security guard for private companies that didn't like to be questioned. Reports often mentioned his discipline, coolness, and habit of acting outside the law when it seemed necessary. His trailer was found a few miles from the foot of Superstition, in a deserted area between a canyon and an old quarry. The place was not marked on any map. There was only dry grass, wind, and endless rocks. A police pickup truck stopped at the trailer at dawn. Williams got out first, looking around cautiously. The silence was so deep that even the sound of his own footsteps seemed too loud. The trailer door was ajar. Inside, it was empty. No personal belongings, only dust and the smell of oil. On the floor were torn pages from a notebook, the charred edges still smoldering in a metal stove. The sink contained ashes and several melted plastic fragments. On the table was a broken cup and a cigarette butt that seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. Williams realized that someone had warned Ryder a few hours before the raid. In a drawer under the bed, they found only a piece of a knife and a few empty shell casings. No documents, no weapons. Ryder was gone, leaving behind only a sense of presence, cold, as if he had just walked out the door. "He was warned," Boyd said quietly, looking around the room. "Yes," Williams replied, "and someone is still covering for him." By the evening of the same day, the detective drove to his office in Florence. It was raining again, the sky was darkening, and the smell of wet dust was in the air. When he reached his desk, his phone vibrated. A message without a signature, without a number. Short, like a command. "Rake the mountains. Go deeper and you'll get buried." Williams looked at the screen for a few seconds. The words seemed meaningless, but the meaning was obvious. A warning, and at the same time a confirmation that his steps were being tracked. The communications department said that the number was unidentifiable, a disposable SIM card bought in cash at a small store near the border. Williams did not respond immediately. He got up, walked to the window, and looked out into the darkness. The mountains were lost in the night sky, and their silhouettes seemed alive. Somewhere there, among these black ridges, was a man who could dissolve into stone like a shadow. The following days were a struggle of nerves. Ryder was not running away. He was playing. His footprints appeared and disappeared like deliberate ghosts. Cameras at gas stations captured a man in a baseball cap who looked like him, but always with a fuzzy face. In the mountains, fresh tire tracks were found, but the GPS readings lost the route in the gravel. One of the local shepherds said he saw a white pickup truck with no license plates parked near an old pumping station. But when the police arrived, the place was empty, with only tire tracks and a can that someone had shot at for fun. Every day, without result, the pressure increased. The department began to whisper that the detective was chasing a phantom. But Williams knew that people like Ryder don't run away in a panic. They watch, waiting for the moment. And when the moment comes, they act. Late in the evening, when most of his colleagues had already left, he sat in his office over a map. He marked with red marks the places where Ryder could be seen. The lines intersected near the northern slope, exactly where Elijah had once disappeared. It was no accident. He was back where it all began, Williams told himself. He realized that there was not enough direct evidence against Stone. Everything was based on conjecture and indirect connections. Without Ryder himself, the case fell apart. And if he disappeared forever, no one would know who pulled the trigger. The detective decided to act. He ordered Stone to be transferred from the detention center to a secure facility and said that he was preparing a deal with the investigation. It was a bluff, but enough to get the word out. If Ryder was still watching, he wouldn't let it go unreacted to. That evening, Williams did not go home. He stayed in the office, reviewing files and an old photo from the discovery site. A rusty barrel pulled from the darkness glowed on the monitor in the corner. Elisha's face, which he had only seen in a university photo, stood before his eyes. Around midnight, he received another message. The same unknown numbers, the same dry tone. Take him out of the light, and the darkness will leave you alone. Williams smiled wryly. This game was crossing the line. He realized that Ryder wasn't just hiding. He was trying to break him psychologically. But such words did not frighten the old detective. On the contrary, they confirmed that the enemy was close by, and he was nervous. The next morning, the detective gathered the team. There was no hesitation in his voice. "Stone will be our key," he said. "We will force Ryder out of the shadows, and this time he won't have time to escape." No one objected. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. A thin haze of dust stretched over the Superstition Mountains, like smoke after a gunshot. It seemed that the earth itself was waiting for the hunt to change direction, and this time the hunter was really going to become the prey. The rain stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture. In the small interrogation room, the pressure was physical. The lamps were pressing down with light, the walls seemed to be closing in, and the ticking clock was particularly loud. Detective Mark Williams entered the room slowly, without any demonstration. He knew that there were two ways to win the game: cunning or pressure. This time he chose the second. Stone was sitting at his desk, looking a little paler than he had during the first search. Books from previous editions stood on the shelf behind him, and the windows were fogged with cold morning air. The sound of the mountain wind could barely be heard from the outside world, a reminder of the place where the story began. "Mr. Stone," Williams began briefly, "you know a lot about these mountains, and even more about who rules them outside the law. You can't sit on two chairs anymore." Stone answered calmly, as always, politely, with a touch of academic sarcasm. He tried to talk about science, about books, about how all historians are just collectors of facts. But Williams's words were simple and without unnecessary emotion. The evidence that had been seized bore his signature, and under his seals were the actual amounts of the transactions, the names of the companies, and maps of water sources. In his jacket pocket was a copy of the Vista development contract. The detective did not ask for it. He showed it to him. Statements, photocopies, correspondence, traces of transfers to accounts, notes on drilling, everything that turned the legend into a business plan. Each piece of paper fell on the table like a hammer. Stone tried to avert his eyes, put his hand over his mouth, and look for every saving phrase that could make him a consultant. "I didn't kill that guy," he whispered, but his voice was shaking. "This isn't about the trigger," Williams interrupted quietly. "This is about who made sure no one knew about the water under your property, who organized the security, who took the documents, who had hands that were not afraid of dirt." The pressure built up deliberately. Williams convinced Stone that it was no longer about honor or science. He offered a deal, a plea to fraud, a minimum sentence if he gave up the perpetrator and told about the communication protocol, or full prosecution as an organizer if he kept quiet. The decision was simple on paper, but scary in reality. Stone was not a militant. His life lectures, archives, books did not prepare him for violence. Under the weight of the facts, he began to break down. Long pauses, sips of water, small gestures of despair. The words came out of him like a wounded animal. He knew about the one-time chat, about a method of communication that was used only once, without trace, an encrypted application bought with cash, with access that deleted messages as soon as they were read. "I don't know where he is now," Stone finally said, "but I know how to contact him. The protocol is simple: a one-time code, a transition to a closed chat room, a message with a timer. Once opened, it disappears. Ryder has always used this." He said, "No trace, no problem." Williams listened attentively and showed no emotion. This was the moment when you could make the stick bend in the right direction. He suggested a tried-and-true method, using weakness as bait. Under police surveillance, Stone was to send a message that only he could invent, an urgent request for help, a supposed admission that the documents in the vault needed to be destroyed immediately because the police already know. The plan was cold and simple as a stone. Stone agreed with fear in his voice. He was going to do something he would never have dared to do without pressure: call the man who had been acting with his hands and get him to show up. When the first line of the message appeared on the smartphone, the camera in the corner flashed in a testy way. There was no sentimentality among the people watching the room. It was a human network stretched between fear and hope, between truth and danger. Stone spoke the text, his fingers trembling, and the words fell on the screen like a sentence. On the eve of dawn, when the mountains were just beginning to cast their shadows, Williams felt that he had taken a step that would either end the case or deepen it even further. There was no easy way back from this line. Either the light would bring out the truth, or the darkness would swallow the traces again. The mountains stood silent, as if listening. The dungeon where Elijah Dean had once disappeared was now covered with cables, lights, and the cold gaze of armed men. The dawn had not yet reached the ridges, and fans were already running underground, blowing dust and the smell of oil. The police had cordoned off the perimeter of the old mine, the one that the documents called the vault. Detective Mark Williams stood at the entrance, holding a helmet and flashlight. Next to him were two operatives who were preparing the descent. Everything looked like a routine operation, but the silence of the mountains was stretched like a string. Somewhere down there, among the dark passages, the case that had been waiting for the truth for 2 years was about to be resolved. Stone was brought in before dawn. His face was gray. His eyes had lost the cold confidence with which he had once spoken of legends. He was forced to send a message, and he did. Now he sat in the observation vehicle, shivering like a man who can already see his own grave. Around 5 in the morning, the traffic cameras captured a figure moving along the slope. A lone silhouette, walking without light but confidently, as if it knew every ledge. Ryder. His body merged with the shadows. His movements were precise, cold, like a hunter's. He approached the mine cautiously, holding his backpack over his shoulders. When he stepped inside, the first light in the tunnel flickered. The sound of his footsteps was almost inaudible. Williams' radio beeped a short signal as he entered the perimeter. The detective and his team moved deeper into the cell where the boxes of documents once stood. The air smelled of earth and old diesel, and the dust kicked up by the movement lay on their polished helmets like ash. Ryder appeared suddenly, like a blob of darkness. His face was half hidden under his hood, his eyes calm, without fear. He held a weapon, but did not raise it. Williams stepped forward, taking just enough of a step to make his voice echo off the walls. "Jacob Ryder," he said evenly. "There's no going back." Ryder didn't answer immediately. His gaze slid over the lights, over the walls, over the file cabinets. Finally, he smiled, briefly, without warmth. "You know, Detective," he said quietly, "in these mountains, every digger was looking for his gold. I was looking for silence." Williams did not move. He knew there was a team with guns behind him, but he spoke calmly, as if he were not facing an armed killer, but a man who needed to be given one last chance. "Elisha Dean," he said, "was not the enemy. He was just looking for a story. Like your daughter draws her paintings, he was drawing a map, the history of the land." Ryder froze. A brief moment, barely noticeable, but it was there. That name shifted something in him. Williams knew he had hit the right spot. An old photo was found in the file, a little girl with crayons, Ryder in uniform next to her. It was a long time ago, but the memory remained alive, even in him. "Don't talk about her," Ryder said sharply, and the lights reflected the shine of the steel in his hands. The detective took another half step. "You did it for Stone's money, but he's already betrayed you." The words fell like a drop into the void. And at the same moment, Stone emerged from the side tunnel. His arms were raised, his voice breaking with panic. "Jake, surrender! It's over! We can still make a deal!" Ryder turned around slowly, his eyes darkening. "You failed me, David," he said calmly. Stone took a step back, but it was too late. Ryder raised his weapon, not aiming at people. His sights were on the boxes, the ones containing the reports, maps, and purchase plans. One shot, another, and the documents burst into sparks, the flames swallowing the dust. The police responded automatically. Short bursts echoed through the walls, reverberating with a dull roar. When the smoke cleared, Ryder was lying on the ground. Blood was darkening between the splinters of wooden crates. Stone stood aside, trembling, his eyes never leaving his face. Williams slowly walked over and checked his pulse. Ryder was alive, but barely breathing. His weapon was removed, and silence reigned in the tunnel again. Later, experts recorded that in Ryder's backpack, they found spare magazines, knives, and ballistic traces that matched the bullets recovered from Elisha Dean's body. It was the confirmation they had been waiting for 2 years. Stone sat at the exit of the mine with his hands over his face. When they picked him up and put him in the car, he did not resist. It didn't feel like a victory, but like the end of something that had begun much earlier, when the first blow of the shovel tore through the earth. Despite the damage, they managed to save the evidence. Some documents survived, enough to prove the scale of the fraud. Stone agreed to cooperate with the investigation, admitted his involvement in the fraud, and agreed to testify against Ryder. When the operation was completed and the police went outside, the sun was already setting in the east. The mountains were quiet again. Williams looked back at the black opening of the mine, where Elisha Dean's story had once begun, and where it had finally ended. In the report he wrote that day, the last sentence was the words, "He was looking for history underground, but found the truth that they wanted to hide. Mountains don't keep secrets. They are just waiting for someone to dare to hear them." The sun was rising over Arizona, illuminating the red rocks. And for the first time in 2 years, the winds of superstition sounded not like an echo of fear, but like a quiet, calm breath. Elisha Dean could finally rest in peace.